Every year, countless elderly lives hang in the balance, waiting for someone to step up. But what happens when a single act of courage changes everything? Imagine being the only one who can make that choice. Would you act, or would you let the moment slip away? Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. Jaden Carter was no stranger to hardship. At just 23 years old, he had already weathered challenges that would have broken many, balancing a part-time job at a local diner and night classes at the community college. Jaden's days were a whirlwind of work, study, and quiet determination. Despite the weight of his responsibilities, he always found time to give back. Whether it was tutoring local kids or volunteering at the food bank on weekends, Jaden had a knack for bringing light to others, even when his own path was shadowed with struggle. He was known in the neighborhood as someone dependable, a young man with a kind heart and a quiet resilience that earned him respect beyond his years. In the same neighborhood, Eleanor Harris led a very different life. At 72, Eleanor's days were quieter, but not without their own struggles. Once the matriarch of a prominent family, she now found herself alone in a sprawling house that felt far too large. Her children lived across the country, and her late husband's absence echoed through the halls. Despite her wealth, mobility issues had made her increasingly dependent on others. But Eleanor was proud, perhaps to a fault. She rarely asked for help, venturing out herself when she needed to, her cane her only support. To the outside world, she was a picture of grace, but inside loneliness weighed heavy. The suburban neighborhood where Jaden and Eleanor lived was a patchwork of lives and stories. On any given day, the streets buzzed with activity, joggers taking to the sidewalks, delivery trucks rattling by, and neighbors exchanging quick greetings as they hustled through their routines. It was the kind of place where paths crossed often but rarely lingered, where everyone seemed to move to their own rhythm. On one such day, Jaden was walking home from his morning shift, earbuds in, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The warm sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the pavement. His mind was preoccupied with thoughts of his upcoming midterms and how he'd make rent that month. Across the street, Eleanor emerged from a small grocery store, a paper bag tucked under her arm and her cane tapping lightly against the sidewalk. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as she made her way toward the pedestrian bridge that spanned the busy street. Neither of them noticed the other, their lives moving on separate tracks as they so often did. But fate had a different plan. The bridge was old, the kind of structure that looked sturdy from a distance, but up close revealed cracks and weathered edges. As Eleanor stepped onto the incline, she stumbled slightly, her cane catching on an uneven plank. The bag in her arm wobbled precariously, and she paused, adjusting her grip. A few people passed her, offering polite but distant glances before continuing on their way. Jaden, still lost in his thoughts, was about to cross the street when a muffled sound caught his attention. He glanced up, his eyes scanning the bridge, where Eleanor now stood frozen, her expression a mix of fear and frustration. Something about the scene pulled him from his own world and into hers. At that moment, neither could have imagined how their lives were about to intersect in a way that would change them both forever. Eleanor Harris was determined to maintain her independence, even if it came with its challenges. That afternoon, she decided to run a few errands at the corner market, a task she usually avoided but felt necessary after her weekly groceries hadn't been delivered. The trip itself wasn't daunting. It was the walk back that made her anxious. Her cane, though sturdy, offered little comfort on uneven terrain, and the narrow pedestrian bridge she had to cross always gave her pause. But Eleanor was nothing if not resolute, and she pressed on, ignoring the nagging voice in her head that suggested she call for help. By the time she reached the bridge, the sun was high, casting sharp shadows over the structure. The bridge spanned the shallow but fast-moving creek that cut through the neighborhood. It was old, with weathered wooden planks that creaked underfoot. Rusted railings lined its sides, but their height left much to be desired. Eleanor gripped her cane tightly and adjusted the paper bag in her arms, filled with essentials that suddenly seemed heavier than they had in the store. She stepped onto the bridge, the rhythmic tapping of her cane against the wood almost soothing against the distant screech of the hum of passing cars. But as she reached the midpoint, her foot caught on a raised plank. The stumble was minor, but it threw off her balance just enough to make her cane slip from her grasp. She tried to steady herself, her free hand reaching for the railing, but the angle of the bridge made it difficult. The bag in her other arm wobbled precariously, and in her effort to save it, she lost her footing entirely. Eleanor cried out as she fell, landing hard on her side, her paper bag spilling its contents across the planks. Her body slid slightly toward the edge of the bridge, and she instinctively grabbed onto the nearest railing with trembling hands. The rushing water below seemed louder now, the sound echoing in her ears as she clung to the metal bar. Panic surged through her. She wasn't hurt, but the angle of her fall left her vulnerable. Her cane was out of reach, her legs shaky from the impact, and the edge of the bridge felt dangerously close. A few people passed by, their footsteps quick and uncertain. One man paused briefly, glancing at Eleanor before muttering something under his breath and walking away. A couple on the opposite side of the bridge slowed, whispered to each other, and then continued, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. Eleanor's chest tightened. The fear in her eyes grew as she realized she was truly alone. Dah! At that moment, Jaden Carter was walking along the creek below, taking his usual shortcut home after a long shift. He had his earbuds in, the muffled beat of a song filling his ears as he navigated the rocky path along the water. The sound of Eleanor's cry barely registered at first, but the urgency in her voice cut through the music like a sharp note. He pulled out one earbud, stopping in his tracks as he glanced upward. From his position, he could see the bridge clearly. Eleanor's small frame was hunched near the edge, her hands gripping the railing tightly as her legs wobbled beneath her. The spilled groceries and the discarded cane told him everything he needed to know. Jaden's heart raced. For a moment, he felt frozen, watching the scene unfold as though it were part of a distant dream. Then Eleanor's eyes locked onto his, wide with fear and desperation. "Help!" she called out, her voice trembling. "Please, someone!" Jaden didn't hesitate. He sprinted up the path toward the stairs that led to the bridge. As he climbed, his mind raced. The bridge wasn't particularly high, but the fast-moving water below and Eleanor's precarious position made the situation critical. He reached the top just as Eleanor's grip faltered, her fingers slipping slightly against the railing. "Ma'am, hold on!" Jaden shouted, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He could see the fear in her eyes, her knuckles white as she clung to the rail. Behind him, a small group of bystanders had gathered, murmuring among themselves but making no move to help. Jaden didn't have time to be frustrated. His focus was entirely on Eleanor. He moved closer, careful not to startle her. "I'm here to help," he said gently, his tone calm and reassuring. "I need you to hold on just a little longer. I've got you." Eleanor nodded weakly, her breath coming in short gasps. The bridge creaked under Jaden's weight as he knelt beside her, assessing how best to pull her to safety. The rushing water below roared in his ears, and he could feel the collective gaze of the bystanders on his back. But none of that mattered. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was Eleanor. Jaden knelt beside Eleanor, his mind racing as he took in the situation. The surface of the bridge was slick from a light drizzle earlier that morning, and the edge where Eleanor had fallen looked even more treacherous up close. Her grip on the railing was weakening, her fingers trembling against the rusted metal. Jaden's stomach churned as he calculated his next move. This wasn't just about pulling her up. One wrong step could make things worse for both of them. Okay, he said, his voice calm but firm, masking the anxiety bubbling inside him. "I'm going to get you back on your feet, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Eleanor nodded, her breathing shallow. Her wide eyes betrayed the panic she was trying to contain. But there was a flicker of hope in her expression as she looked at Jaden. He exuded a quiet determination, and though she didn't know him, something in his tone made her believe he could help. Jaden's mind raced through possibilities. The bridge was narrow, and the angle of Eleanor's fall made it hard to get a solid grip on her without risking her slipping further. He glanced back at the bystanders, hoping for someone to step forward and assist. But they only started, their uncertainty palpable in the murmured conversations and shifting glances. It frustrated him, but there wasn't time to dwell on it. "I need you to hold onto the railing as tightly as you can," Jaden said, leaning closer. "I'm going to lift you slowly, but you've got to help me by steadying yourself." "I don't know if I can," Eleanor stammered, her voice breaking. Her hands trembled against the metal, her strength clearly fading. The pieces on the table singly invited, Eleanor forced herself to resolve. "Yes, you can," Jaden said, his tone unwavering. "You've made it this far, ma'am. We're going to finish this together." He braced himself, his sneakers slipping slightly against the damp planks as he adjusted his position. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound loud in his ears. The thought of failure crept in, though. What if he couldn't pull her up? What if he slipped? What if he made a mistake? But then he looked at Eleanor's face, her fear mixed with the fragile glimmer of trust, and he pushed the doubts aside. Taking a deep breath, Jaden slid his arm under hers, his other hand gripping her wrist securely. Eleanor winced as he pulled her slightly upward, and he quickly adjusted, easing her weight against his own to make it more manageable. "It's going to feel shaky at first," he said, his voice calm despite the strain. But I've got you. Just focus on keeping your feet steady." Eleanor nodded. Her breathing labored but more controlled now. Jaden felt her trying to push herself up with her legs, and he adjusted his grip, giving her the leverage she needed. His arms burned with effort, but he didn't let go. His focus razor sharp on every inch of progress. The bridge creaked ominously beneath them, and Jaden shifted his footing to keep them both balanced. The sound of rushing water below filled the air, a constant reminder of the stakes. But Jaden kept his attention on Eleanor, watching her movements closely and encouraging her every step of the way. "You're doing great," he said, his tone steady. "Just a little more." Eleanor's breathing grew heavier, but she held on, her grip on the railing tightening as Jaden lifted her higher. Her cane, still lying out of reach, seemed like a distant worry compared to the immediate challenge of getting her back on her feet. Sweat beaded on Jaden's forehead as he gave one final push, guiding Eleanor upright until she was standing shakily on the bridge. For a moment, neither of them moved. Eleanor leaned heavily against the railing, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. Jaden stayed close, one hand lightly on her arm to steady her. "You did it," he said softly, his voice filled with relief. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "No," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "You did." The bystanders, who had been frozen in place, began to clap hesitantly. A few murmurs of admiration rippled through the small crowd. But Jaden barely noticed. His focus was still on Eleanor, ensuring she was stable before letting her stand on her own. "Are you hurt?" he asked, scanning her for any signs of injury. Eleanor shook her head, her voice regaining strength. "No, just shaken. Thank you so much." Jaden offered her a small, reassuring smile. "I'm glad I was here." As the tension of the moment began to ease, Eleanor's fear gave way to trust. She clung to Jaden's arm as he guided her to a safer spot away from the edge of the bridge. The trembling in her hands subsided, replaced by a quiet confidence in the young man who had stepped in when no one else would. In that moment, Eleanor realized just how close she had come to a different outcome. And as she looked at Jaden, she saw not just her savior, but a symbol of selflessness and courage. Jaden's arms strained as he gave one final heave, pulling Eleanor fully onto the bridge's walkway. She collapsed onto her knees, gripping the railing with trembling hands. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Jaden knelt beside her, catching his breath, his muscles quivering from the effort. His heart pounded not just from the physical strain, but from the realization of how close the situation had come to disaster. Eleanor sobbed quietly, her face buried in her hands. Tears streamed down her cheeks, a mixture of overwhelming relief and lingering fear. Jaden placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, unsure if he should say something or give her space to process what had just happened. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Take your time." The sound of clapping broke the tension in the air. Jaden looked up to see the small crowd of bystanders applauding. Some had their phones out, recording the scene, while others whispered to each other, pointing in admiration. A middle-aged man stepped forward hesitantly and offered Jaden a hand to help him stand. "That was incredible, young man," the man said, his voice thick with sincerity. "You saved her life." Jaden nodded, offering a faint smile, but his attention quickly returned to Eleanor. She had shifted into a sitting position, her breathing still uneven, but no longer panicked. He noticed her hand trembling as it reached for a handbag that had fallen beside her during the chaos. Without thinking, Jaden leaned over and picked it up for her. "Here," he said, placing the bag gently in her lap. "Is this yours?" Eleanor looked up at him, her tear-streaked face softening into a grateful smile. "Yes, thank you," she whispered, clutching it tightly. As she opened the bag to check its contents, Jaden caught a glimpse of a small orange bottle with a white cap, a prescription for heart medication. His stomach tightened as the gravity of the situation sank in. If he hadn't been there, the outcome might have been far worse. It wasn't just about saving her from falling. Her life could have been in jeopardy in multiple ways. "Do you need your medicine?" Jaden asked gently, his voice tinged with concern. Eleanor nodded, her hand still shaking as she fumbled with the bottle. Jaden carefully took it from her, twisted off the cap and handed her one of the pills. She swallowed it with the help of a water bottle offered by a bystander who had finally stepped forward to assist. "I didn't realize," Eleanor murmured, her voice breaking. If you hadn't been here." Jaden shook his head, crouching down so they were at eye level. "But I was," he said simply, his tone filled with quiet reassurance. "That's what matters." The applause grew louder as more people gathered around, offering words of praise and admiration. A young woman in the crowd approached with a blanket, draping it over Eleanor's shoulders. Another bystander handed Jaden a bottle of water, which he gratefully accepted, his throat parched from the adrenaline rush. "Are you a paramedic?" someone asked, their voice cutting through the murmurs. Jaden turned toward the questioner, shaking his head. "No," he said, his voice modest, "just someone who happened to be here." Eleanor, now regaining some of her composure, looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. "You're much more than that," she said, her voice steadying. "You're my hero." The words struck Jaden deeply, leaving him momentarily speechless. He had acted on instinct, driven by a sense of responsibility and compassion. He hadn't sought recognition or gratitude. He had simply done what he felt was right. But hearing those words from Eleanor, seeing the genuine gratitude in her eyes, made him realize just how much his actions had mattered. The crowd began to disperse as the tension eased, though a few people lingered, still moved by what they had witnessed. One man stayed behind, pulling Jaden aside. "Hey," the man said, extending a hand. "I don't know how you stayed so calm, but that was something else. You've got guts, kid." Jaden shook the man's hand, offering a humble smile. "Thank you," he said. "I just did what anyone would do." The man chuckled. "Trust me, not everyone would have done what you did. Most people just stand by and watch." Jaden glanced back at Eleanor, who was now sitting upright with the help of the kind woman offering her support. He couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. He hadn't just saved a life, he had stepped up when no one else did. And as he watched Eleanor begin to recover, he knew that moment would stay with him forever. "Thank you again," Eleanor said, her voice steadier now. She reached for Jaden's hand, squeezing it gently. You didn't just save me, no, reminded me that there's still so much good in the world. Jayden smiled, his chest swelling with pride. You're welcome, ma'am. I'm just glad I could help. As he stood there, the applause and murmurs fading into the background, Jayden realized that this experience had changed something within him. It wasn't just about what he had done. It was about the connections formed, the lives touched, and the reminder that even in the most ordinary moments, extraordinary things could happen. Eleanor sat on the small bench by the pedestrian bridge where she had nearly lost her life just a week ago. The crisp morning air carried a sense of renewal as she gazed at the water below, her thoughts swirling with gratitude and resolve. Jayden sat beside her, his youthful energy a stark contrast to her measured calmness. The pair had met several times since the incident, their bond growing stronger with each conversation. You know, Eleanor began, her voice warm but reflective, when you pulled me back to safety, you didn't just save my life. You reminded me that it still has value. I'd been drifting, Jayden, feeling disconnected and invisible, but you changed that. Jayden turned toward her, his expression humble but curious. I was just in the right place at the right time, he said modestly. Eleanor shook her head with a faint smile. No, you're the right person. There's a difference. Her words lingered in the air, and Jayden felt a quiet sense of pride, though he didn't let it show. For him, that day had been about doing what felt right in the moment. Yet, as Eleanor shared more about her life, the loneliness, the struggles with aging, and her desire to feel useful again, he realized just how profound his actions had been. The two had struck an unexpected partnership. Eleanor, with her years of experience and financial stability, had begun mentoring Jayden, helping him navigate his dreams of completing his education and pursuing a career in social work. In turn, Jayden's optimism and drive inspired Eleanor to step out of her isolation and reconnect with the world around her. I've been thinking, Eleanor said, breaking the silence. There are so many people in this community who feel invisible, just like I did. Maybe we can do something about that together. Jayden's brow furrowed slightly as he considered her words. What do you mean? I want to start a community outreach program, Eleanor explained, her voice growing more animated. Something to bring people together, young and old, different backgrounds, different stories. We could offer mentorship, support, and resources. I can fund it, but I'll need your help to connect with people. Jayden's face lit up with a smile. You'd really want to do that? That sounds amazing. Eleanor nodded. It's time I stopped sitting on the sidelines. Your courage inspired me to take action. And who better to partner with than the young man who reminded me how much people can do when they care? The idea took root quickly. Over the next few weeks, Jayden and Eleanor began laying the groundwork for their initiative, reaching out to local leaders, businesses, and volunteers. Jayden's connections through his community work and Eleanor's resources proved to be a powerful combination. The outreach program became a symbol of what was possible when generations and perspectives came together for a common purpose. Through their efforts, Jayden found his voice as a leader, speaking at community events and inspiring others with his story. Eleanor, once hesitant to engage, now found herself energized by the relationships she was building and the lives she was touching. She no longer felt like an outsider in her own life. Their bond became a testament to the idea that acts of kindness could ripple far beyond the moment. What had begun as a life-saving rescue on a narrow bridge had transformed into a partnership that was reshaping a community. Both Jaden and Eleanor found purpose in their shared mission, proving that courage and compassion could bridge even the widest divides. As they stood together at the opening event for their outreach program, surrounded by smiling faces and the hum of conversation, Eleanor leaned over to Jaden and whispered, "You've done more than save a life. You've started something that will outlast both of us." Jaden smiled, his eyes scanning the room. "I couldn't have done it without you." The evening was filled with laughter, stories, and a palpable sense of hope. For Eleanor, it was a reminder that it was never too late to find meaning and connection. For Jaden, it was a validation that one act of bravery could change not just one life, but many. As they walked away from the event, side by side, Eleanor reached out and patted Jaden's arm. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," she said with a glimmer of determination. Jaden nodded. "I'm ready if you are." And with that, the pair set off, their journey only just beginning, a journey that would continue to remind them, and those around them, of the extraordinary power of compassion, courage, and the simple act of stepping forward when it matters most. This story proves how a single act of bravery can transform two lives and inspire a community. What would you do if faced with a moment like this? Share your thoughts and real-life experiences in the comments below. Don't forget to explore more uplifting stories on our channel. Let's come together to celebrate the extraordinary power of kindness and courage. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories.